The letter hit the dirt floor of the barn at Holt Harding's boots like an accusation. He had found it tucked inside the cedar chest he kept locked in his bedroom, the one he had not opened in 3 years, the one that held the last pieces of a life he had burned down deliberately and without apology. His hands were shaking as he held the yellowed envelope, and the woman standing in the doorway of his barn. The woman who had been sleeping under his roof for 4 months now, the woman whose laughter had slowly cracked the ice around his chest like a spring thaw he had not asked for and did not deserve, was watching him with eyes that had gone still and careful in a way that told him she already knew what was inside. "You went through my things," he said, and his voice came out quiet, which was worse than if he had shouted. Adaline Jennings did not flinch. She had stopped flinching at things months ago, and that shift in her, that slow growing of a spine she had arrived without, was something he had watched happen like watching a sapling push through frozen ground. He had admired it. He had been proud of it, though he had never said so. And now that quiet strength she carried was being turned directly at him, and it felt like staring down the barrel of the only gun in the room. "I found it when I was cleaning," she said. "The way I was hired to clean. The lock was broken. The lock was not broken when I left this morning." The silence between them stretched out long and dangerous, the way silences do when both people know that the next word spoken will change everything. Outside, the January wind came screaming off the Colorado plains and threw itself against the barn walls like something trying to get in, and the single lantern hanging from the rafters swayed, throwing shadows that lurched and clawed at the straw-covered floor. "Her name was Clara," Adaline said finally. "Your wife. She didn't leave you, Holt. She died, and someone let you believe for 3 years that she chose to go." He crossed the barn in 4 strides, the letter crumpling in his fist, and he stopped close enough that she could see the muscle working in his jaw, close enough that she could smell the cold air and wood smoke and leather that clung to him the way certain truths cling to a person. "You had no right," he said, but the fury in his voice was already threading through with something rower, something more frightened, and they both heard it. "No," she agreed. "I didn't. But someone needed to tell you the truth, and since everyone who knew it stayed quiet for 3 years, I decided I would rather lose your good opinion than watch you carry a lie for the rest of your life." He stood there breathing hard, and the letter in his fist held the weight of everything he thought he had understood about the last 3 years of his existence, which was to say, it held the weight of a broken man's entire story, rebuilt from the wrong foundation. This is where the story truly begins. 4 months earlier, in October of 1883, Adaline Jennings had arrived at the Harding Ranch outside the town of Carver's Creek, Colorado, on the back of a borrowed mule with 37 cents in her coat pocket and a recommendation letter from the pastor's wife in the town of Dunmore, 40 miles south. She was 24 years old and had recently survived the specific kind of catastrophe that comes not from disaster but from slow erosion, the kind where you wake up one morning and realize that the life you are living belongs to someone else entirely, and that someone else has not been kind with it. She had been married for 2 years to a man named Gerald Prout, who had been charming at the county social and an entirely different creature inside the walls of their home in Dunmore, where charm had no audience and therefore no purpose. She had left him in September with the clothes on her back and a satchel of belongings, and she had walked to the pastor's house in the rain, and the pastor's wife, a practical woman named Ruth Calloway, had dried her out and fed her and given her a piece of advice that would change her life. "There is a man named Holt Harding who owns 400 acres north of Carver's Creek," Ruth had said, pouring coffee that was strong enough to strip paint. He has been living alone out there for 3 years, and his house has gone half to ruin for lack of care. He is not an easy man, but he is a decent one. He needs a housekeeper for the winter, someone to cook and clean and keep the place from falling apart before spring. He pays honest wages. What happened to him? Adaline had asked. 3 years alone. Ruth had chosen her words carefully, the way a person does when they know more than they intend to say. His wife left, she had said, and then she had looked down into her coffee cup as though the conversation were over. Adaline had taken the letter of recommendation, and the borrowed mule, and the 37 cents, and she had set out north because she had no better direction to travel in, and because something in the sparse way Ruth Calloway had described Holt Harding had made her curious in the specific way that certain damaged things make a person curious. Not with pity exactly, but with the feeling that there was a story there that had not been told correctly yet. She arrived at the Harding Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was the color of old pewter, and the first suggestion of winter was threading through the air like a warning. The ranch house was a large, solid structure built from Colorado pine, 2 stories with a wraparound porch that had clearly once been maintained with care, and was now sagging at one corner, the boards warping, a rocking chair sitting on it with one broken runner tilted at a forlorn angle. Behind the house stretched a barn and 2 smaller outbuildings, and beyond those, the land opened up into the kind of space that the Colorado plains offer in all directions, enormous and indifferent and breathtaking if you were in the mood to be breathtaken, and slightly terrifying if you were not. She found Holt Harding at the fence line at the west end of his property, mending a section of split rail that the October wind had knocked loose. He was tall, built with the particular leanness that comes from years of physical labor, with dark hair gone slightly too long, and a jaw that suggested he had not put thought into shaving in recent memory. He was 31 years old, though he carried something in his eyes that made him seem older than that, a particular quality of exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep, and everything to do with grief that had been left to calcify in the dark. He looked up at her approach and waited without expression for her to explain herself, which she found immediately interesting. Most men she had known greeted a woman arriving alone with some form of either suspicion or performance, and Holt Harding offered her neither. He simply waited, his forearms resting on the fence rail, his brown eyes patient and unreadable. She explained herself. She showed him the letter from Ruth Calloway. He read it twice, handed it back, and looked at her for a long moment. "Room and board plus $2 a week," he said. "There's a bedroom off the kitchen with its own door. I work from before first light to after dark. I don't need conversation or company, just a clean house and food that doesn't taste like burned leather. The previous 2 women I hired lasted 3 weeks and 2 weeks respectively before deciding the isolation was too much. I'll understand if you reach the same conclusion, but I'd appreciate knowing before I rely on you rather than after." "I'll stay the winter," she said. "You say that now." "I say that because I mean it," she said, and something in her voice must have read as reliable, because he gave a short nod and picked his tools back up and returned to the fence, which she correctly interpreted as an invitation to take herself and her mule to the house. She stood for a moment in the doorway of the ranch house before she stepped inside, and what she saw stopped her breath for just a second. The house was structurally magnificent. Large rooms, high ceilings, solid, handsome furniture, windows that in better condition would have let in good light on all sides. But everything was covered in the accumulated grime of 3 years of minimal attention, and there was a particular quality to the neglect that went deeper than dirt. Dishes were functional, but the decorative ones had been pushed to the backs of shelves and faced to the wall. There were squares of lighter paint on the walls where pictures had once hung and been taken down. In the sitting room, there was a settee with a floral pattern that had clearly once been the centerpiece of someone's carefully arranged domestic vision, and it now sat shoved against the wall, facing nothing, covered in a horse blanket. Someone had lived here and loved here and then been systematically removed from every visible surface, and the removing had been so thorough and so deliberate that it had left the house with the specific atmosphere of a place where something was being deliberately not said. Adaline rolled up her sleeves and went to work. By the end of the first week, she had scrubbed every surface in the kitchen, organized the pantry, repaired the worst of the loose floorboards using tools she found in a box under the stairs, and produced 4 dinners that Holt Harding ate in silence but ate every scrap of, which she took as the highest available form of compliment under the circumstances. He came in at the end of each day and sat at the kitchen table and ate what she put in front of him and went to bed, and in the mornings she rose early to find that he had already been up and gone for an hour. He was not rude. He said thank you for the food consistently, and when something was particularly good he would pause and look down at his plate with a slight change of expression that suggested he had not expected to enjoy anything that much, and was slightly inconvenienced by the fact that he had. But he did not make conversation, and he did not encourage it, and for the first 2 weeks Adaline respected that. Then, on a Tuesday evening in late October, a genuine Colorado blizzard came rolling in off the mountains with about 40 minutes of warning and absolute savage intention. Holt got his horses in and his cattle accounted for, and made it back to the house with ice in his hair, and his jaw set against the cold. And Adaline had hot coffee and venison stew waiting because she had watched the sky all afternoon and read what it was saying. He came in and stopped in the kitchen doorway at the sight of the stew and the coffee and the fire built up high in the hearth, and something crossed his face that she had not seen on it before, something that was almost startled. "Storm hit faster than I expected," he said, somewhat unnecessarily. "Sit down," she said. "You look frozen through." He sat. He wrapped his hands around the coffee mug and stared into it for a moment, and then, as though something had come loose that he had not meant to loosen, he said, "My grandfather built this house. He came out from Tennessee in 1849 with $400 and a wagon team and an idea, and he spent 30 years building this ranch from nothing. My father was born in this house. I was born in this house." He stopped. The blizzard screamed at the windows. "I always intended to raise my own children in it." He said it simply as a fact, and then he picked up his spoon and began to eat, and the subject was closed. But Adaline sat down across from him with her own bowl because there were no other chairs and the kitchen was warm and the storm was settling in for the night, and something between them had shifted by about 2 degrees, which in the mathematics of 2 careful people is a significant distance. Over the following weeks, the shifts kept coming, small and almost imperceptible, like the way a river changes course, not in sudden dramatic lurches but in the patient daily work of water against stone. He began to linger slightly longer at the kitchen table after dinner. She began to read in the evenings in the sitting room rather than her bedroom. And one night he came downstairs for a lamp he had forgotten and found her there with a book of poetry she had found on his shelves. And instead of retreating, he sat in the chair by the fire and picked up a copy of the 1883 Farmer's Almanac, and they read in the same room without speaking for 2 hours, and both of them slept better that night than they had in longer than they could easily say. She learned things about him the way you learn things about a private person, not from what they tell you but from what they do. He was meticulous with his animals, spending extra time with a horse that had gone slightly lame in the left foreleg, talking quietly to her in a voice he never used inside the house. He kept his books in perfect order, a serious library for a ranch house, volumes on agriculture, history, poetry, and an entire shelf of geological texts that suggested an intellectual curiosity he kept well hidden beneath the laconic exterior. He was fiercely capable with his hands, able to repair or build almost anything, and he did it with a craftsman's attention that bordered on devotion. She also learned the shape of what he was not saying. He never mentioned her by name. He never mentioned having been married. The only evidence of that previous life that remained visible was the settee in the sitting room, which he could have moved or covered or removed entirely, but had not, and which she came to think of as the single crack in the wall he had built, the one thing he had not been able to entirely erase. In the middle of November, she asked him about the books on the geological shelf, and he talked for 20 minutes about the mineralogy of the Colorado Rockies with a quiet but unmistakable animation that made him look, for that 20 minutes, like a completely different person. Or perhaps, she thought, like the person he had been before whatever had happened to him. He caught himself at the 20-minute mark, stopped mid-sentence, and looked at her with a slightly suspicious expression, as though he suspected her of deliberately drawing him out. "You asked to be polite," he said. "I asked because I wanted to know," she said simply. He studied her for a moment. "You do that," he said. "You say what you mean. I try to. It's uncommon." "I know," she said, and she thought but did not say, especially for a woman who spent 2 years learning to say nothing at all. She had not told him about Gerald Prout. She had not told him much about herself at all, and he had not asked, which was both a courtesy she appreciated and a distance she was beginning, slowly and without entirely meaning to want to close. She was aware, in the abstract way one becomes aware of dangerous things, that she was developing feelings for the man who employed her, feelings that were inappropriate on multiple levels and inadvisable on every practical ground, and which she tried to address by throwing herself with extra energy into the work of keeping his house. The house was, by early December, in genuinely beautiful condition. She had taken down the curtains and washed and rehung them. She had polished the furniture until it glowed. She had rehung 2 of the pictures she had found in a closet, landscapes, nothing personal, and pushed the settee back to its natural position in the center of the sitting room and put the horse blanket away, and the room had exhaled in a way that she felt rather than heard. One morning in the first week of December, she was in the back bedroom upstairs. Not Holt's bedroom, which she had never entered, but a smaller room she had been using for storage. And she found, pushed behind a set of old grain sacks, a large wooden box full of items that clearly belonged to a woman. A hairbrush with a silver back, a hand mirror, a small collection of ribbon and lace, a journal with a clasp lock, several dresses, good quality, carefully folded. She closed the box and carried it downstairs and set it in the kitchen and waited for Holt to come in for the evening. When he saw it on the table, his face went through 3 separate expressions in quick succession and then settled into nothing at all. "I found it in the back bedroom," she said. "I didn't look through it. I thought you would want to know it was there." "Put it in the barn," he said. "In the back room with the other things I don't use." She was quiet for a moment. "Holt," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name since she arrived, and they both noticed it. "The dresses in there are good wool. It's going to be a brutal winter. I could take the fabric and make something practical from it. I don't have to know whose they were." He looked at the box for a long time. Then he said, "Do what you think is best," and he sat down for dinner and did not say anything else that evening. The next day she remade 2 of the dresses into a heavy winter skirt and a quilted vest that she wore against the Colorado cold, and she thought, as she cut the fabric, about how much it is possible to know about a person through their things. The clothes had been well made and well kept. The woman who had owned them had cared about her appearance without being vain about it, which told a story of self-respect. The fabrics were practical colors, dark blue and gray and a deep burgundy, not frivolous. She had been, whoever she was, a sensible and capable person, and she had loved this house, and something had happened to remove her from it. December deepened into the kind of cold that the Colorado plains do without mercy or apology. The mountains to the west became a white wall that seemed to inch closer every week. Adaline kept the house warm and kept food on the table, and kept herself occupied with the 100 small tasks that a property of that size in that climate requires. And she and Holt developed the rhythm of two people who have stopped pretending they are strangers. He began to tell her things, small things at first. He told her about the cattle operation, about the deal he was trying to close with a rancher in Denver that would expand his herd significantly in the spring. He told her about a dispute he was having with his neighbor to the east, a man named Dale Croft, who had been grazing his cattle on Harding land without permission, and who had responded to Holt's complaint with the specific kind of aggressive innocence that indicates guilt and confidence in one's own ability to avoid consequences for it. He told her about the winter of 1876, when his father had driven the herd through 3 days of blizzard conditions and lost only 2 head, and the pride in his voice when he talked about his father was a quiet and beautiful thing. She told him smaller things. She told him that she had grown up in Missouri, that her father had been a schoolteacher, and her mother had died when she was 11, that she had wanted to be a teacher herself before circumstances had redirected her life in ways she was still in the process of walking back from. She did not tell him about Gerald Prout. She told him she had been married and it had not worked and she had left and was starting over, and he accepted this with a nod that communicated both that he understood what had been said and that he would not press for more. It was a mid-December evening, after a dinner of roasted chicken and potatoes, and the first decent apple pie she had managed from his meager pantry stores, that he told her about Clara. He had not meant to. He had been sitting at the kitchen table while she cleared the dishes, and she had said something about hoping the weather would ease enough for a supply run to Carver's Creek before Christmas, and something about the Christmas reference had undone a latch somewhere inside him. "My wife left at Christmas," he said, and then he looked like a man who was surprised to find himself speaking. Adaline set down the dish she was holding. She turned to face him but kept her distance, instinctively understanding that this required space around it. "She left a note," he said. He was looking at the table. Said she couldn't stay. Said the isolation was destroying her and she needed to go back east where she had family. "I came in on Christmas Eve and the house was half empty and the note was on this table." He put one flat hand on the kitchen table as though the note were still there and he was pressing it down. "I looked for her. I wrote to her family in Ohio. They said she hadn't come. I hired a man to look, a tracker out of Denver. He found a trail that led to the stage road and then nothing. He told me she'd boarded a stage east and disappeared." He stopped. I paid him for the information. I chose to believe him. I told myself she was alive somewhere and had chosen not to be found, and I had to let her go. He got up from the table and went to the window and stood looking out at the dark. And Adaline stood very still in the middle of the kitchen, because she understood that she was witnessing something that had been pressed down behind 3 years of silence, and was finally finding the pressure too great to hold. "Her name was Clara," he said. "She was 26 years old. She laughed at things I thought no one else would find funny. She put wildflowers in every room in summer. She made this house into a home." He paused. And then she was gone, and I tore everything down that reminded me of her because I thought she had chosen to leave me, and I could not be in a house full of someone who had chosen to leave me. "I'm sorry," Adaline said, and she meant it in all the ways that phrase can hold. He turned from the window. "Why are you sorry? You didn't do anything to me." "I'm sorry because you've been carrying something very heavy for a very long time," she said. "And I'm sorry because it sounds like you loved her very much." He looked at her for a long moment with those dark, exhausted eyes, and then he said good night and went upstairs. And Adaline stood in the clean kitchen in the light of the oil lamp and felt something aching and complicated moving through her chest. That night, she lay awake in her room off the kitchen listening to the wind and thinking about Clara, who had loved wildflowers and had been 26 years old. And she thought about the tracker from Denver, who had provided a convenient story that had allowed Holt to grieve without ever having to face not knowing. She thought about Ruth Calloway in Dunmore, who had said his wife left with a quality in her voice that had not been right, that she had noted at the time and filed away. She thought about the note that had been on this table on Christmas Eve 3 years ago, and she thought about how the story of an abandoned husband and a wife who had chosen to disappear was a story she had now heard twice in its telling, and which did not, she realized, feel like the true story. She did not do anything with this thought immediately. In January, the cold became absolute, the kind of cold that the Colorado high plains specialize in after Christmas, a cold that has opinions about you and intends to make them known. Adaline made herself useful in every possible way. She helped Holt break ice in the water troughs on the mornings when the cold came down hard enough to freeze them before dawn. She learned to manage the cookstove more efficiently when wood was scarce. She mended every item of clothing in the house that needed mending. She organized the root cellar. She made preserves from the dried fruit stores. She taught herself from one of the books in Holt's library to make a tallow candle and produced enough of them to last until spring. It had never been opened. She set it on the desk. She looked at it for a long time. Then she put the other letters back in the crate and put the crate back on the shelf. And she stood in the study in the thin winter light with the sealed letter on the desk in front of her and made a decision that she knew might cost her everything she had built here. She opened the letter. Adaline read the letter twice. Then she sat down in the desk chair because her legs had gone unsteady. Clara had not left him. Clara had died. She had died on a stage road in December of 1880, 3 years ago, in circumstances that an attorney in Denver had considered suspicious enough to investigate. And this letter, which had been addressed to Holt and which would have ended 3 years of cruel uncertainty and allowed him to grieve honestly, had never reached him. It had been buried in a crate of papers on a high shelf in a room he never used, sealed and silent. She was still sitting at the desk when she heard the sound of Holt's horse in the yard. She folded the letter carefully and held it in her hands and thought about what to do with it. And the decision she came to was the one that would lead to the confrontation in the barn on that January evening with the wind screaming outside and the lantern swaying and the truth finally, after all this time, out in the open where it had needed to be for 3 years. She had gone to the cedar chest in Holt's bedroom because she had needed the whole picture before she spoke. The cedar chest she had assumed was another piece of storage furniture to clean around until she had found, on its surface, fresh scratch marks around the lock that told her it had been forced open recently. And when she examined it, that the lock had in fact been broken from the inside, which was strange. Or rather that the mechanism had rusted and failed rather than been forced. She had lifted the lid and found inside more of Clara's things. A Bible with her name inscribed, a wedding photograph, more letters, and folded beneath everything. A second letter from William Stearns dated February 1881 that was nearly identical to the first. A follow-up, noting that Holt had not responded to the initial inquiry and urging him in the most direct legal terms to come to Denver to provide testimony and to receive his wife's effects. 2 letters. Neither of them opened, because someone had ensured they were buried. She had gone to the barn with both letters and waited for him. And the confrontation that opened this story had taken place. And now Holt Harding was standing in the January cold with a crumpled letter in his fist and 3 years of his life, rearranging themselves around a truth that was both simpler and more devastating than the lie had been. He stood very still for a very long time. Adaline did not move. She had said what needed to be said, and she understood that what came next was not her to manage. "She died," he said. His voice was flat and strange. "Yes. She didn't leave me. No. She died on the stage road north of Denver." He looked at the letter in his hand. "She was trying to go somewhere, or she was put off the stage. The letter says they were investigating it as a potential crime." "Yes." He turned away from her and put his forearm against the barn wall and pressed his forehead against it. And she heard the breath come out of him in a long, raw sound that was not quite a sob and was worse for it. The sound of a man whose grief had been running on the wrong track for 3 years and had just found the correct one, and the track change was violent. Adaline stood in the barn doorway and let him have it, because that was the only decent thing to do. And she thought about the 3 years he had spent in that house stripping away every evidence of the woman he had loved, believing she had chosen to go, living inside a story of abandonment when the true story was loss, which is a different and in some ways kinder grief, because at least in loss, there is no question of being worth loving. When he turned back around, his face had been reset into something starker and more open than she had ever seen on it. "Those letters were on my own shelf," he said, "in my own house. Someone put them there knowing you wouldn't find them, or hoping you wouldn't." "Dale Croft," he said, and it came out cold and certain. "He managed my affairs for the first 6 months after Clara disappeared. I was in no state to do it myself. He handled my mail, organized my papers. He was my nearest neighbor, and I trusted him." His jaw hardened. "He also proposed to Clara twice before she married me." The significance of this landed in the barn like a stone in still water. "Holt," she said carefully, "that's a serious accusation." "I know what it is," he said. He was very still now, the way still water is still, covering depth and cold. "And I know Dale Croft. And I know that he has been stealing my grazing land for 2 years and has been waiting for me to fail at this ranch so he can buy it for next to nothing. And I know that he was in Denver that fall." He looked down at the letter again. "I am going to ride to Denver in the spring. I am going to find William Stearns, and I am going to know what happened to Clara." "Yes," she said, "you should." He looked at her across the cold barn, and the lantern swayed between them. "Why did you open them?" he asked. "The letters." "You could have left them. You could have minded your own business and finished the winter and left in spring with your wages, and none of this would have been your concern." She met his gaze directly. "Because someone deserved the truth," she said. "And because no one else seemed to be willing to give it to you." Something shifted in his face, slow and seismic. "I said things to you earlier," he said. "I wasn't fair. You were startled and in pain, I understand it. I accused you of violating my privacy. You weren't entirely wrong." "I was mostly wrong," he said, "and I am entirely aware of that." "Thank you," he said, "for finding this, for telling me, for not letting me go on believing the wrong thing because it was easier." "You're welcome," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. They stood close together in the cold barn with the winter screaming outside, and neither of them moved for a long moment. And then Holt Harding reached out and took her hand. not in any dramatic way, simply took her hand in his cold bare one and held it and said nothing, and she held it back, and that was enough for that night. He rode to town the next morning and sent a telegraph to William Stearns's office in Denver, and received, within the week, a reply confirming that the case was still technically open, that the investigation had stalled in 1881 for lack of cooperation from the presumed next of kin, and that Mr. Stearns would be delighted to discuss the matter at Holt's earliest convenience. He also received, from the same telegraph wire, a confidential message from a man he knew in Denver, a former lawman named Percy Aldous who now worked as a private investigator, confirming that Dale Croft had in fact been in Denver in November and December of 1880, and had in fact been seen in conversation with the stage line operator who had employed the driver on the route where Clara's body had been found. Holt showed Adaline these messages at the kitchen table and then went quiet for a long time. "We wait for spring," he said finally. "The roads aren't passable for a 2-day ride in these conditions. In March, when the first thaw comes, I ride to Denver." He folded the messages carefully. "And I deal with Dale Croft when I return. The cattle dispute," she said. Among other things, he said. She watched him for a moment. "You won't do anything rash," she said. It was not entirely a question. He looked at her. "I want to," he said honestly. "I want to ride to his property tonight in the cold and ask him directly. I want to get answers from him the fastest way available." He was quiet. "But Clara deserved justice by law, not by whatever I want to do to Dale Croft in a dark field in January, so I wait." "Yes," she said. "That's right." "How do you do that?" he asked. He was looking at her with that direct quality again. "Keep your head that clear." She thought about Gerald Prout, about the 2 years of learning to keep her head very clear in situations that required it for her own survival. "Practice," she said, and did not elaborate. And he, in the manner that had become characteristic between them, accepted this without pushing. January turned toward February, and the quality of things between them changed again, this time in a direction that was harder to navigate because it was warmer. He began to seek her company in the evenings rather than simply tolerate it. He showed her the books he was most interested in, and they discussed them, and she discovered that he had read far more widely than his laconic exterior suggested, and had opinions about what he read that were interesting and sometimes surprising. He was deeply practical, but not without imagination. He was cautious, but not without courage. He was, beneath the 3 years of deliberate emotional barricade, exactly the kind of person she would have chosen to spend time with if she had been in the business of choosing, which she had been telling herself she was not. She was in trouble, she thought. She went to bed that February night and lay in the dark, and told herself a very reasonable and sensible story about finishing the winter and taking her wages and moving on in spring, finding a teaching position, building the independent life she had wanted before Gerald Prout had derailed it, and leaving Holt Harding to the business of healing and justice and whatever came after. She told herself this story very convincingly, and believed almost none of it. The next morning she came into the kitchen to find that Holt had already made coffee, which he had never done before, and had left a mug poured for her on the counter beside the stove. And when she came in, he looked up from the farmer's almanac he was reading and said, "Cold front coming in tonight. I'll need help with the cattle this morning." Then he looked back at the almanac. "If you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. They worked in the cold together all morning, checking on the herd, breaking ice in the troughs, making sure the shelter was adequate, and she discovered that she was comfortable working beside him in a physical way, that they moved well together in the practical sense, anticipating each other, not getting in each other's way, communicating efficiently when they needed to and otherwise not needing to. There was something in this compatibility that she found deeply reassuring on a level she could not entirely articulate. On the ride back to the house, he said, without preamble, "Tell me about the marriage." She glanced at him, startled. "You don't have to," he said. "I know you don't owe me that." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "His name was Gerald Prout. He was not a good man in private, though he was very good at seeming like one in public. I left in September. I walked to Ruth Calloway's house and she pointed me north." She paused. "I learned a great deal in those 2 years about what I will and won't accept, and about the difference between a life that is happening to you and a life you are choosing." He was quiet for a while, riding beside her through the pale winter landscape. Then he said, "He hurt you?" "Yes," she said. "Is he looking for you?" "I don't believe so." Gerald Prout's primary concern is his reputation in Dunmore, and pursuing a wife who left him would draw the wrong kind of attention. He has almost certainly told anyone who asks that I was troubled and left of my own accord, and is now being stoic about it in a way that generates sympathy. She said this without bitterness, simply as an accurate description of a predictable man. Holt was quiet again for a few strides. Then he said very carefully, "I would like you to know that you are safe here." She looked at him. His eyes were on the trail ahead. "I know that," she said. "I've known it since the first week." "How?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Because you talk to your horse," she said. "A man who talks to his horse kindly is reliable in the ways that matter." He glanced at her sideways with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was close enough that she decided to count it. February moved toward its cold conclusion, and the first suggestions of March arrived not with warmth but with a slight, almost imperceptible lightening of the sky at midday. A shift in the quality of the air that the Great Plains does in its own good time without consulting anyone's preferences. A slow unclenching. Adaline noticed it with a complicated mixture of relief and something else she was not ready to name. On an evening in late February, after dinner, Holt pushed back from the kitchen table and looked at her with the direct quality she had come to know. "The arrangement I offered you was through the winter," he said. "End of winter is end of March by any practical measurement, though the cold holds later than that. I'd like to discuss it." She kept her expression neutral. "Discuss what?" "Whether you intend to stay longer than agreed." He paused. "Or whether you have other plans." "I had a thought of looking for a teaching position," she said, which was true. He nodded slowly. "There's a school in Carver's Creek. The teacher left last fall. The town board has been advertising." He was looking at the table. "It would not require you to leave the area." She looked at him. "Holt." He looked up. "Say what you're trying to say," she said. He met her eyes, and she saw the full, complicated weight of him in that look, the grief and the hope and the carefulness, and the courage it took for someone who had been hurt the way he had been hurt to attempt any of this at all. "I don't want you to go," he said. "I want you to stay. Not as a housekeeper. As I don't know exactly what to call it, as whatever comes next. I am aware that this is a complicated thing to ask, and that the timing is not ideal, and that I am in the process of resolving something significant that needs to be resolved before I can be what a person ought to be when they ask something like this." He stopped. "But I wanted you to know before spring, so that you could consider it honestly and make whatever choice is right for you." She sat with this for a moment. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the February wind made its last cold arguments. "I'm going to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to hear it as true and not as something I'm saying because it's what you want to hear." She met his gaze steadily. "I am not afraid of you. I am not grateful to you in a way that would make me say yes to something I didn't want. I did not come here looking for this, and I have spent a considerable amount of time this winter arguing with myself about whether what I feel is appropriate or wise or real. And, he said, and it is all three, she said, despite my best efforts to convince myself otherwise. Something in his face came open like a door. He reached across the kitchen table and covered her hand with his, and they sat there in the firelight with the winter outside and the truth between them. And she turned her hand over and held his, and that was the most romantic thing that had happened to either of them in longer than they could accurately measure. The first week of March, the roads cleared enough for a 2-day ride, and Holt made preparations to leave for Denver. He was methodical and calm about it in the daytime, but she saw in the evenings the weight of what he was riding toward. He was going to have Clara's death confirmed in the full legal sense. He was going to hear the details of how she died and under what circumstances. He was going to sit across from a lawyer in Denver and receive the truth about his wife's last weeks, and all of this was necessary and right, and was going to cost him something significant regardless of how well he bore it. The night before he left, they sat by the fire in the sitting room, and he told her stories about Clara, the good ones, the ones about the wildflowers and the way she had argued passionately about the proper way to make cornbread, and the time she had adopted a lame dog that had followed her home from town and who had lived on the settee for 3 years, and whom Holt had pretended to merely tolerate while secretly being deeply fond of. He told them simply and without performance, and Adaline listened and understood that she was being given something important, that a man who can tell you about the person he loved before you is giving you the whole of himself, the full picture, the truth, and she was grateful for it. When the stories ran out, he was quiet for a while and she was quiet with him. "She was the first great love of my life," he said. "That doesn't change and I don't want it to. But I have learned this winter that grief and life can exist alongside each other if you're willing to let them, and that I'm not being disloyal to her by wanting to be alive again." He looked at her. "You did that. You came in here and cleaned the house and somehow in the process cleaned out about 3 years of things that needed cleaning out, and I don't think you even meant to." "I mostly just scrubbed floors," she said. "You did considerably more than that," he said. He left in the morning, riding south toward Denver with 2 days' worth of provisions and the letters from William Stearns in his coat pocket. And Adaline stood on the repaired porch of the Harding Ranch and watched him go and thought about what it meant to be the kind of woman who could watch a man ride away with a steady heart, who did not need him to turn back and reassure her, who trusted both his intentions and her own judgment. She thought it meant she was becoming someone she recognized and approved of, which had not always been the case. He was gone for 6 days. On the 4th day, a rider came from town with a message that said simply, "Case confirmed. Stearns cooperating fully. Evidence strong. Back in 3 days." He had paid a boy in Denver a nickel to ride the telegraph for him. She smiled at the message and went back to her work. He returned on a Tuesday evening with an expression that was different from any she had seen him wear, quieter in a particular way, like land after a long rain, still and settled, and somehow more itself. He came in and sat at the kitchen table, and she set dinner in front of him and sat across from him and waited. "Clara left," he said, "because she found evidence that Dale Croft had been threatening to burn the ranch. He wanted her gone. He had been sending her letters for 2 years, before and after they married, and when she showed them to me, I didn't take them seriously enough." The muscle in his jaw worked. She left to go to her aunt in Ohio and to get away from him. She took the stage from Carver's Creek. The driver was a man Croft had paid. He put her off the stage 20 miles north of Denver in a December ice storm. She died of exposure within hours. He was very still. "The driver is dead, cholera, in 1881. The stage line owner is in custody in Denver as of last Tuesday. Stearns has enough evidence to bring charges against Croft as well. The sheriff here, she said. I stopped at the sheriff's office in Carver's Creek on my way home, he said. He's already been advised. There will be a warrant for Croft by the end of the week. She reached across the table and took his hand. He turned it over and held hers and closed his eyes for a moment, and she felt the exhaustion of 6 days of necessary grief moving through him. It is done, she said gently. Not finished, but done. You know the truth. Yes, he said. She was brave, Adaline said. She left to protect you and the ranch, and she was brave about it, and what happened to her was a crime and not her failing and not yours. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and his eyes were wet in the way of a man who will not let himself cry and is at the absolute limit of that commitment. She deserved better, he said. Yes, Adaline said. And you are making sure that the person responsible answers for it. That is what you can do for her now. They sat at the kitchen table in the March evening with the first genuine warmth of approaching spring beginning to soften the air outside, and he held her hand, and she let him hold it for as long as he needed. Dale Croft was arrested by the Carver's Creek sheriff on a Friday in mid-March, charged with conspiracy in the death of Clara Harding. The arrest was covered in the Carver's Creek Gazette with a level of detail that the town found both satisfying and scandalous, and the legal proceedings that followed over the spring and summer resulted, in June, in Croft's conviction and sentencing. The grazing dispute over Holt's land resolved itself immediately upon the arrest, and the land Croft had been illegally using was returned with a settlement that Holt put toward expanding the water infrastructure on the eastern section of his property. The school board of Carver's Creek offered Adaline the teaching position in March, and she took it, which meant she stayed in Carver's Creek while continuing to live at the Harding Ranch, which was an arrangement that required a certain amount of honest conversation and a certain amount of community management, both of which she and Holt handled directly and without embarrassment. The honest conversation happened on a March Sunday, when the first real warmth of approaching spring had cracked the cold enough to make the porch habitable for a few hours in the afternoon. They sat on the repaired porch on 2 chairs Holt had brought out with coffee, and he looked out at his land, which was beginning to show the first green suggestions at the edges of the brown winter grass, and he said, I have been thinking about what I want to ask you. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Then ask it. He turned to look at her, and she saw no hesitation in his face, only the directness that had always been his default quality but which had been, all winter, operating in service of self-protection, and was now, she could see, operating in service of something entirely different. I would like to court you properly, he said. I would like to take you to dinner in town and bring you flowers from the spring garden when it comes in and present myself to you as the man I actually am rather than the wreck you found here in October and have been patiently reconstructing all winter. And then, when that is done, I would like to ask you to marry me, but I want to do it in the right order. She looked at him for a long moment. You've thought about this, she said. Extensively, he said. The flowers, she said. You know the garden won't be up until May, I know. So we're talking about a May proposal at the earliest. That seems right, he said. Then I suggest, she said, that we both go to dinner in town on Friday, and then I will give you my evaluation of the courtship as it proceeds, and you may adjust accordingly. He almost smiled. That seems fair. She did smile. I thought so. The spring courtship of Holt Harding and Adaline Jennings proceeded with a quality that the people of Carver's Creek found both romantic and, by the practical standards of frontier life, entirely sensible. He took her to dinner at the hotel dining room in town on Friday evenings. He brought her things she mentioned needing or wanting without making a production of it: a better pen for marking her school papers, a book she had been looking for, a pair of good wool gloves for the morning rides. She came home from school in the evenings to a house that he had begun, incrementally, to make into a home again, replacing the warped porch boards entirely with new ones, rehanging the pictures she had first put up and adding more, putting the settee back in its proper place and buying new cushions for it in the spring. He put wildflowers in every room in May, when the spring garden came in with the particular generosity that gardens in the Colorado foothills offer in a good year. He proposed in the garden on the first Sunday in June in the morning, with the full warmth of Colorado summer coming on, and the mountains clear on the horizon, and the garden full, and the ranch running well, and the legal business with Croft concluded. He had a ring that had been his grandmother's, a small gold band with a single pearl, which he had kept in the same cedar chest where he had kept Clara's things, and he held it out to her with both hands and said, "I would like to spend the rest of my life with you, Adeline. I have been a difficult man to come to know, and you came to know me anyway, and I am grateful for every day of this winter and spring, and I would very much like there to be a great many more days after this one." She looked at the ring and then at him, at the man who had been broken when she arrived and had rebuilt himself through the winter alongside her, who was steady and honest and capable and kind in the deepest sense of the word, who laughed now with his whole self when something struck him, who had loved before and had grieved it correctly once he had been given the truth, who was offering himself to her openly and without conditions. "Yes," she said. "With great gladness, yes." He put the ring on her finger and she put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him in the garden in the June morning, and it was the truest thing that had happened to either of them in a very long time. They were married in July of 1884 in the Carver's Creek Methodist Church, on a Saturday when the mountains were spectacular in the midday light, and the town turned out in a manner that suggested it had been waiting for something to celebrate for a while. Ruth Calloway came from Dunmore, which was both deeply appropriate and which made Adeline cry when she saw her, the good kind of crying that comes from gratitude. The summer at the Harding Ranch was full in the way that a life being actively lived is full. Holt closed the deal with the rancher in Denver that he had mentioned in October, and the herd expanded as planned, which required 2 additional hands hired on for the season, young men named Tom and Illy who were competent workers, and who treated Adeline with the respectful formality that suggested Holt had made his expectations on that subject perfectly clear. She taught through the school term, which ran from September through May in Carver's Creek, and her students, ranging in age from 6 to 14, responded to her with the combination of wariness and trust that children extend to new authority figures they have not yet categorized, and she worked carefully and consistently to earn the trust side of that equation. In the evenings, she and Holt sat on the porch that was no longer sagging, and he told her about the ranch, and she told him about the school, and they talked about the news that came through the telegraph, and the conversations at the general store, and the slow, ongoing business of being 2 people making a life together in a place they had each, by different routes, arrived at needing. In October of 1884, exactly 1 year after she had ridden up to that fence line on a borrowed mule, Adeline realized she was pregnant. She told Holt on a Sunday morning in the kitchen over coffee, simply and directly, which was how she told him most things, and he set his coffee mug down and stared at her for a moment that seemed longer than it was, and then he came around the table and pulled her to her feet and held her with his face pressed against her hair and said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said, "I have wanted this for a long time, since before, and I had stopped letting myself want it." He was very quiet, "Thank you. I had some help," she said. He laughed, which was one of her favorite sounds in the complete inventory of sounds available on the Colorado plains. The winter of 1884 to 1885 had a completely different quality from the winter before. The house was warm and inhabited, and full of the specific energy of expectation, of a life in preparation for itself. Adaline continued teaching until March, when the last stages of her pregnancy made the daily ride to town inadvisable, and then she was at home, and the house which she had spent a winter making habitable became, under her continued attention, something that could genuinely be called beautiful. She found, in the spring, a box of Clara's things she had missed the first time, a small collection of pressed flowers between the pages of a book on a high shelf. She brought it to Holt, and they looked through it together, and she framed two of the best preserved specimens in simple wooden frames she bought at the general store and hung them in the hallway, where they remained. Holt looked at them for a long time when she first put them up, and then he kissed her on the cheek and said nothing, which was everything. Their son was born in April of 1885, on a Tuesday morning when the spring had come in fully, and the garden was in the first flush of its new season, and the mountains were clear and blue to the west. The birth was attended by the doctor from Carver's Creek, and by Ruth Calloway, who had become a fixture of the household in the manner of certain practical and beloved women, and who managed the entire proceedings with the calm competence of someone who had been present at dozens of births and found drama in the context counterproductive. The boy was healthy and loud and had Holt's dark hair from the first day, and Holt held him in the kitchen light the afternoon of his birth with an expression that Adaline, watching from the bed the doctor had insisted she stay in for the rest of the day, knew she would remember for the rest of her life. It was the expression of a man who has come back from a very long way. They named him James. James William Harding, the William for William Stearns, the attorney in Denver who had kept the case open and had handed Holt the truth he needed. Stearns, when informed by letter of the honor, wrote back a reply that was uncharacteristically emotional for a man of the law, and which Adaline kept in the box where she kept the important letters. James Harding grew with the enthusiasm and determination that children in good homes tend to bring to the project of themselves. By summer, he was recognizably himself, opinionated about food and vigorous about everything else, and he had his mother's habit of considering things directly before speaking about them, and his father's habit of fixing things that were broken with a craftsman's deliberate patience. Holt expanded the ranch over the next 2 years, adding a second water source on the east side that finally resolved the grazing capacity issues the property had always had. Adaline taught through the school terms, and found in the work the particular satisfaction of a person doing the thing they were made to do. She had 12 students by 1886, and 2 of them were the children of the ranch hands Tom and Ellie, who had both married and settled in the area with the frontier practicality of young men who have found a good situation and the good sense to stay in it. The house on the Harding Ranch became, in those years, the kind of house that other houses measured themselves against without quite knowing it. It was not grand or showy, but it was maintained with care and inhabited with intention, and full of the evidence of people who paid attention to their lives. There were books in every room and wildflowers in season and good smells from the kitchen, and a porch that was solid and welcoming, and the land around it was productive and well managed, and there were horses in the barn that were spoken to kindly. On a May evening in 1887, Adaline sat on the porch with James, who was 2 years old and deeply interested in a beetle he had found on the porch boards, and watched Holt come in from the fence line at the western end of the property, silhouetted against the long golden light of the Colorado evening, walking with the particular ease of a man who is where he belongs and knows it. She thought about the October morning she had arrived on the borrowed mule, about the way the house had looked then, the warped porch boards, the pictures taken down, the settee facing the wall. She thought about the letter on the kitchen table, and the cedar chest, and the January night in the barn with the lantern swaying. She thought about betrayal and hidden truth, and the cost of a dark secret left in the dark for too long, and about the strange mercy of being the person who happened to find those letters on that shelf on that January afternoon, and about how the whole arc of it, from October to spring, from the borrowed mule to the ring in the garden, felt in retrospect less like coincidence and more like the kind of long, patient working out that life does when it has something to say. Holt came up the porch steps and sat beside her, and James showed him the beetle with the gravity of a scientist presenting significant findings. And Holt received this information with appropriate seriousness and asked several thoughtful questions about the beetle's business on their porch, and James answered them with the information available to him, which was limited but delivered with great confidence. "Good evening," Holt said to her over James's head. "Good evening," she said. Adaline found out she was pregnant for the second time in September of 1887, and this time she told Holt on the porch in the evening light, and he squeezed her hand and looked out at the land and said, "I keep thinking it can't get better than it already is." "And then it does," she said. "And then it does," he agreed. Little Clara was born with her father's dark eyes and her mother's particular quality of direct attention to everything in her visual field. And she was, from the first weeks, a person of decided opinions and considerable volume, which her brother found interesting and her parents found both exhausting and deeply amusing. James, who was 3 years old when his sister arrived, received her with the combination of suspicion and proprietary pride that small children extend to new siblings, and within a month had appointed himself her primary educator on the subject of beetles and interesting rocks, and the correct method of getting the barn cat to come when called, information that Clara received with rapt if uncomprehending attention. The spring of 1888 was the best the Harding Ranch had seen in a decade, by anyone's measure. The herd was strong, the land was productive, the water infrastructure Holt had built out over the previous 3 years was paying dividends in ways that showed up directly in the bottom line of the ranch accounts, which Adaline managed with the same meticulous care she brought to everything. The school in Carver's Creek was thriving. The town was growing, slowly but steadily, with new families arriving from Kansas and Missouri and Nebraska, people looking for exactly the combination of opportunity and stability that the Colorado Plains offered in those years. One evening that spring, Holt came in from the barn with a letter that had arrived from the attorney Stearns in Denver. The Croft legal case had concluded entirely, all appeals exhausted, all judgments final. He handed the letter to Adaline across the kitchen table, and she read it and set it down and looked at him. "It's over," she said. "It is," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "All of it. The uncertainty. The unfinished business." She nodded. "I want to do something with that eastern parcel," he said. "The one Croft was grazing on illegally. I was thinking a proper orchard. Apples and pears. It would take 5 years to come in fully, but by the time James is grown there would be a working orchard on that land." She looked at him. He was talking about building things that would outlast them, planting trees whose fruit they would eat together for 40 years and whose shade their children and grandchildren would sit in. "An orchard," she said. "Too ambitious," he said. "Not even a little," she said. He smiled at her, that full, unguarded smile that she had first heard in a laugh over a stubborn nail, and which she now received most days, and which never failed to land somewhere warm in her chest. "Adaline," he said. "What?" "I want to tell you something that I should have said clearly a long time ago and have said in parts and implications, rather than directly." She waited. "When you came here in October, I was a man who had made a deliberate project of not being alive. I kept the ranch running because that was duty and habit, but I had put everything else, every part of me that required other people or warmth or hope, into a locked room. And then you arrived, and you cleaned the kitchen and fixed the floorboards and made food that was better than I deserved, and you read in the sitting room in the evenings, and you asked me about the geology books, and you found those letters, and you told me the truth, and you stayed." He looked at her steadily. "And everything I had locked away came back, all of it, and it came back better than it had been before, because now I understand what it is to have it and to almost lose it and to get it back." He reached across the table. "You did that. I know you came to clean the house, and I know that is a considerable understatement of what actually happened." She took his hand. Her eyes were bright. "I came to clean the house," she said, "and I ended up with rather more than I bargained for." "Is that a complaint?" he said. "Not remotely," she said. The orchard was planted that fall, 40 apple trees and 20 pear, in the eastern parcel where Dale Croft's cattle had once grazed without permission. Holt and Adaline planted them together on a Saturday in late October, with James helping in the way that a 3-year-old helps, with great enthusiasm and variable accuracy. And the work took all day, and left them tired in the satisfying way of work that matters. At the end of the day they stood at the edge of the newly planted orchard as the sun went down behind the mountains, 40-year-old trees in their first year, small and unpromising looking and full of intention. And Holt put his arm around Adaline's shoulders and she leaned into him, and they looked at what they had planted together on ground that had once been contested and taken, and was now, clearly and permanently, theirs. 5 years, he said. "Give or take," she said. "We'll eat the first apples in the fall of 1893, he said. "And make pie," she said. "And make pie," he agreed. The house was warm and lit and waiting for them, the way it always was now, because it was a house that was inhabited by people who came home to it and intended to keep doing so. They put the children to bed, James in his room with his rocks and his beetle observations that he kept in a small journal Adaline had made him from folded paper sewn together, and Clara in the small room off the main bedroom that had been the room Adaline had first slept in when she arrived as a housekeeper, and which was now the nursery, which both of them found quietly satisfying in a way that had to do with how much had changed and how completely. Holt built up the fire and Adaline made tea, and they sat in the sitting room that had once had its settee facing the wall and which now had it back in the center where it belonged, with good cushions and a lamp that threw warm light, and the wildflower prints Adaline had framed from Clara's pressed collection hung in the hallway outside. And the house was full of the particular deep peace that comes to places where the right things have happened. "Do you ever think about where you would be," Holt said, "if Ruth Calloway had pointed you somewhere else?" Adaline considered this. "I think about where I came from," she said, "which is enough to make anywhere else I might have gone feel like a very narrow escape." "You came here with 37 cents, he said. She glanced at him. "How did you know that?" Ruth told me. "She tells me most things. She considers it a pastoral responsibility." He was not quite smiling. "She also told me she almost didn't give you the recommendation, because she thought you might be too gentle for this work and this winter and this specific man." "What changed her mind?" "She said you looked at her directly when you talked to her, and that direct-looking people were reliable." He paused. She was correct. Adaline set down her tea. Holt Harding. What? I want you to know, she said, with the same simple directness she had always used with him, that this is the life I would have chosen if someone had put all possible lives in front of me and let me choose. This exact one, with you and James and Clara and the orchard that isn't grown yet, and the school in Carver's Creek, and the porch that you fixed, and the geology books, and the way you talk to your horses. She met his eyes. I want you to know that clearly and not just in implication. He looked at her with the eyes that had been exhausted when she first saw them and were not exhausted anymore, that were warm and clear and entirely present. I know it, he said. And I want you to know that whatever part of my heart was given away before, the rest of it, every remaining piece of it, has belonged to you since about mid-November, when I watched you fix that fence railing in the cold and argue with a nail and win. He paused. Which is to say that you came here to clean my house for the winter, and by spring you owned half my heart, and by summer you owned all of it, and I expect you to go on owning it for the rest of my life. I can manage that, she said. I expect you can, he said. Inside, Adaline leaned her head against Holt's shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the warm light of their living room in the life they had built together from what had seemed like nothing, from a housekeeper's agreement and a pair of sealed letters and a locked cedar chest, and a January night in a barn, from the specific and improbable mercy of one woman with 37 cents deciding that a man she had never met deserved the truth. The fire crackled. The wind made its low sound around the corners of the house. The mountains held their places. Everything was exactly where it belonged,